Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is Alexander Lim, and we are on another episode of Author Story. Our featured book is a novel, The Lawyer's Guild, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. The author, Howell Woltz, spent 7 years under illegal detention in the United States and now lives in Eastern Europe to spread his message about what he feels is the betrayal of the American people by those within its government. So, Howell, welcome back to Author Story. Thank you for being our guest yet again.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me out. It's always a pleasure.
You're welcome. So, Howell, we've discussed things with you before in a previous episode of Author Story, and you had a lot to say. So now, I don't want to rehash specifics of your experience with the American judicial system, your subsequent flight to Eastern Europe, since this was covered, but the book is related to that, I suppose. What made you decide to write The Lawyer's Guild?
Well, telling a true story or writing books about how to reform the justice system can cause a lot of yawns. So I decided to take real experiences, true cases, cases I'd worked on almost exclusively or experiences I had had, and put them out in a novel form so it would be an entertaining story. It's also very challenging when you have to fact check every preposition and syllable because you know that the Department of Justice is looking for a reason to harass you again. So it was fun to actually tell the truth, but dress it up as a sort of entertaining novel. I hope it's entertaining. I was laughing out loud writing it, so I hope some of the readers enjoy it.
All right, cool. Okay. So, just about the novel itself, I mean, there's, just to point it out, there's a difference between verisimilitude, stuff that appears to be real, and what is really so in novels. I mean, I remember I used to be a big Tom Clancy fan when I was younger, and I remember a military guy reviewing it saying that his novels are verisimilitude. So, how much of The Lawyer's Guild is verisimilitude, and how much of it is for real?
The only character in it that's not based on someone I have known or dealt with is this Professor Quinlan character who joins the Lawyers Guild as a former professor at my alma mater, University of Virginia. And he's someone I guess I would like to have been Professor Quinlan, so I made him up out of thin air. But everyone else in it, including the President of the United States and all of this host of horrible characters that were trying to bring him down and just got busted by their own people. They are all real, and the stories I told about them are real, and they are now those stories that I knew over a year ago are now coming out in mainstream media.
All right. Okay. Okay. So just a little break for our listeners. I'd just like to acknowledge that our neighbor's dog is barking. So if you hear a dog barking, that's the neighbor's dog. So just to let you guys know. Okay. So where was I? Oh yeah. So you know, as you say, the novel might be a fictional story, but I'm sure you've changed some of the names in here. But the essential facts, are these for real?
Absolutely. The one of the worst, most evil characters in the book was a federal judge in eastern North Carolina. All I did was modify the name, but the horrible things he has done and continues to do today at age 87, he's still doing them. The head of the Bar Association, the cabal that runs it, those are all real people, and I knew them throughout my 65 years, some of them for most of it. So these are real people doing really bad things, and I think anyone that's been following what has now been labeled the Russia hoax, where they used many of these same tactics against the President of the United States, and in nothing less than an attempted coup. And they have now been caught. And as of this last 2 or 3 days, the tide is turning, and it is now the mandate of Congress and an independent counsel, the same one I mentioned in the book. This retired or he quit from being a federal judge out in Utah. I used the name Haber, but it's actually Huber or vice versa. They are coming out with indictments against the head of the CIA, the head of the FBI, and that top tier who created this dossier that was unproven and unverified, presented it to a federal court in a secret court to get permission to wiretap the Trump administration, and did. It's just no one would believe it as a true story, though it is now true. But it's all in this book, and now it's all coming to fruition as I was dreaming it would happen a year ago, and now it really is.
All right, right, okay. Now, I'd just like to throw out a figure I read in the book. I mean, just for our listeners to get a real handle on how major this thing is. I mean, 78 million Americans in prison. Is this figure accurate to your knowledge?
No, it's 7.3 million are in prison on
Oh, okay,
parole or probation right now. So
okay.
that's a world record number, by the way. But 71 million as of 2010, and I got this number directly from the Department of Justice, have been convicted. They have a felony, a big scarlet F on their chest for life. And when you combine that with another fact that came out from Columbia Law School, where they tabulated 6,740, excuse me, 5,760. I'm mixing up my numbers. Criminal capital cases where they're going to kill the person when they convict him, they found a 73% error rate, and 9% of the people were absolutely innocent. So if you've got an 82% error rate when you're killing someone, I'm telling you from working over 400 criminal federal cases myself, that it's even worse when they're not going to kill you.
Yeah, and the figure alone, like 70 million Americans, like the population of the United States is 300 million. 70 million comes to around what? Somewhere between 20-25%, between one-fourth and one-fifth of the entire American population. Now, I'm thinking, if I see a number like that, I'm thinking either a whole generation of parents screwed up major, or there is something seriously wrong going on here.
Yeah, there's something seriously wrong because, and then when you juxtapose that number with the now admitted rate by the courts reviewed these cases themselves over a 23-year period, which was almost every capital case in America. So if you juxtapose that with that 71 million, you got 58 million Americans that are very likely to have been wrongfully charged or adjudicated by their own admission. So that is a holocaust in itself. And think of all those people who were literally murdered by the state and didn't just spend decades wrongfully in prison. But I can give you the exact quote from one of my other books. I'll look for it while we're talking. But the BNA Criminal Law Reporter in May of 2010 was my source, and they said 1 in every 4 Americans, approximately 25%. So their math is not very good, but because 25% of 300 million is quite a bit more, but they were close.
Right, right. And I think, I mean, 58 million wrongfully imprisoned. I mean, just with the appeals alone, that's a lot of time, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of effort that's wasted, on a wrongful conviction, wrongful
Well,
imprisonment.
that's why I not only imply, I made it very clear what I think. This was a plan to disenfranchise unwanted groups. The majority of the people that I met when they were riding me around America, 29 moves between jails and prisons all over the country to keep me hidden. But most of the people I met were either black or brown. So I think there was a systemic plan to disenfranchise, because when you get that scarlet F on your chest, you can no longer vote. You can no longer protect yourself and your family. You no longer have access to federal programs, many of them, though you're still required by law to pay for them. I mean, it's a real scandal. So the only conclusion that I could come up with was that this was an intentional attempt by those in power to disenfranchise those that did not want to have the vote.
All right, okay, okay. So that's, I mean, that really is a game changer when it comes to like electing people, electing officials.
Absolutely.
Right. So let me get on to another aspect of the novel, the progressives. I mean, we've covered some of this in our past interview, and in your novel, you make references. They're starting to make inroads in the American government as early as I think 1917 with President Woodrow Wilson.
Yes, he was elected in 1913 to a second term, and he wrote a book called, and he was financed by J.P. Morgan and the progressives that also financed the Russian Revolution. Interestingly enough, that piece of history has also been left out of American history books. But he wrote a book called The New Freedom, and it was his admission that he was a, quote, progressive. He was also extremely racist. Excuse me. He was the first president since the Civil War that segregated everything. That was him. And he launched the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. But that is part of progressivism. It's a very leftist, top-down management, Soviet-style socialism where the government runs everything. And his takeaway from The New Freedom, his book, was he said that American freedom was actually slavery, and that if we have all these bureaucrats telling us everything to do, then we're free to go about our business and paint or draw or write music. So it sounds very much like our recent bombshell Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's spouting the same nonsense now. But socialism's never worked. And what really blows my mind, being 65 and growing up when we were having to practice going home by foot because the Soviets were going to start a nuclear war. There wasn't any doubt in anybody's mind. It was just when, and we had a bomb shelter, and now these people want to go back to that system voluntarily. I don't think so.
Right, okay, got that. So, based on the information you dug up, I mean, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the progressives seem to have upped their game in the 1970s when they began making their moves. Is this the case, or were they already in action ever since 1917?
As basically in 1913, there were three events that started the disappearance of the American way, and that was where Wilson and his fellow Democrats created something called the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal or a reserve. It's an independent money creation machine that created by the Glass-Owen Act, that he allowed his backers, J.P. Morgan, the Roosevelts, the Warburg family, and the Rothschilds of England and France. They owned this private bank. It is now still privately owned, but by many, many banks and financial institutions, but it's still the same purpose. Excuse me, it's printing the public currency by a private bank, which Thomas Jefferson said was the only thing more dangerous than a standing army. Now America has both of those horrible things.
All right, okay. So in the book, you paint the progressives as an organization which, you know, for lack of a better word, is essentially a global evil empire which has influenced such things as Soviet revolution. I mean, I remember reading in your novel about Trotsky being wined and dined by the progressives while the revolution was going on in Russia. Based on what you have put together, how widespread is this organization and its reach?
Well, it's not huge, but it's very powerful. And again, I'm not making this up. It's in the writings of Carroll Quigley, was a professor at Georgetown University, actually hired by the progressive movement, the founders of the Federal Reserve, these same people that then pushed through in 1913 the 17th Amendment to eliminate states' representation in Congress. Let me take a side note there why this is so important, because the people, we the people, had a contract with the government we created, and we had our states create that government for us. We then voted on it. So there are actually three parties to the contract: we the people, our states, our nation states, which were sovereign entities unto themselves, and the government we created. What the 17th Amendment did was basically eliminate the representation of the states, because the senators were elected in the Constitution by the state legislatures, and only there. And that's the one thing I've found in the Constitution that the founders said absolutely could not be changed. They were so wed to this principle and balance, yet they did it anyway in 1913, because then the power could flood to this centralized federal government in Washington, and it has. And then the 16th Amendment was another bypass of the Constitution, which prohibited a capitation tax, as it was called, and created where they could put their hands in our pocket at any time. So, and that only was approved by 4 states, as I believe also referenced in previous books. I used Supreme Court cases to prove it. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I said, here, you read the cases and you decide. But that's why I say that was the beginning of the end, was those 3 acts that one year, but it took the next 50 years for them to consolidate a rewritten history enough and sell it to the American public, and a world war in between, and then FDR pretty much carried the water from there.
Right. Okay. We've got the some of the protagonists in. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the characters in your book. I mean, I have to mention this, possibly the biggest elephant in the room, the president. Your depiction of him and of his family around him seems to be at odds with what, a lot of folks think about him. What can you say about that?
The man is imperfect. I compared him to John F. Kennedy in another book. They were both womanizers and scamps in many ways, but they also got more done and had America at heart. John Kennedy was the last true conservative, even more so than President Reagan. But they were flawed characters. I mean, if you want to go biblical, they both remind me a bit of David, king of Israel and the ancestor of Jesus. And he put his concubine's his secret lover, adulteress, put her husband on the front lines of battle to get him killed so he could have her for himself. He sired many children with many wives. That reminds me of Mr. Trump a little bit. But then he was the greatest psalmist in the book, and it was revered for the good things he did. So I don't think that the instrument is always the prettiest or the best that divine forces may choose to change the world. But like David, this man, if he saves America and the world from this bent toward progressive socialism under the control of a handful of elites, then he'll be written about 1,000 years from now, too.
Okay, all
Or
right.
4,000. I'm not sure he'll reach as far as David did, but he'll get to 1,000. I'll guarantee you.
Okay, okay, got that. All right. So I also talked about. I like also. You also write about other controversial personalities like Julian Assange and George Soros, and their presence in your novel is impactful. Again, as with my question about the president, how accurate is their real-world personality compared to the ones you write about?
I don't really know because I don't know either of them, but I have studied Soros. I've been to Budapest. I've been to the places where he was helping turn in his fellow Jews to go to death camps. He's also admitted that on 60 Minutes. I believe I even included the address of the interview in case anyone doubted it. So this man was a Nazi sympathizer and collaborator working against his own people. There is no more evil human being. His adoptive Christian father was the Nazi in Budapest who was in charge of confiscating the Jewish wealth. Much of that disappeared. It did not make it to Munich. And a few years later, George Soros is one of the biggest currency destroyers in the world, requiring massive, massive amounts of money to do so. And I don't think he made it running errands in Budapest. So the man has a lot of history there that is horrible. And when I look at his agenda, it is not different at all, or really in any way, than the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They call it Nazi, but I'm going to spell it out so people know what it really was named.
Right.
And the Italian Marxist Party of Mussolini. That's just a continuum of the same idea. A small handful control the rest, and we are all equal, but we're equally poor rather than equal in opportunity. And
Right.
I choose equal in opportunity, and each one has a chance to climb up the ladder rather than all being poor and miserable.
All right. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'd like, this novel. I mean, the ending is like everything goes back to the Constitution. All these agencies that were created by executive order, decree without passage through Congress, I believe. All of this is gone, and it's really back to the Constitution. I'd like to, yeah,
It's headed that way. That's why it's a novel. So
right. Okay, so I just want, because I mean this, but I just want to cover this because this, for all we know, this might come true. Um, the a potential concern with this kind of endgame. Now, according to the United States Constitution, the only three crimes punishable are treason, piracy, and counterfeiting. Um,
that's correct.
Right. Now, we live in a world where there's cybercrime, there's organized crime, cult brainwashing, and those sort of things. Would would a return to the Constitution really return to the Constitution, the crimes stated? Would that not weaken the capability of people to seek redress from being victims of such activities?
Absolutely not, because it was designed that way, leaving the power with the states. The states are supposed to control under Federalist 45, for example. Madison, the crafter of the Constitution, in large part, wrote in Federalist 45 that what we're trying to do is make this limited federal government, which is basically for us to have free and open exchange of goods across our boundaries without tariffs, a common currency, and common defense. But everything else that affects the people's lives is supposed to stay within the purview of the state. So if you are taken advantage of in your state, then that's a state issue. Now, if you go across state lines and coordinate crime across those lines, then that involves the other state as well. But that's where the states would decide to jointly address it rather than having this horrible, overly powerful FBI, which again, as you mentioned, was created outside of law because Congress told President Teddy Roosevelt in 1907 that it was unconstitutional and illegal, so he declared it with an executive order. Another thing that I can't find in my Constitution, there's no such thing in Article 1. And the NSA, as I mentioned, also was created by Harry Truman outside of law with an executive order. So was the NSA, the CIA, NSA, all of these letters, many of them were created under Truman, and then the rest were created by subsequent presidents using this same illegal act. So it doesn't reduce our ability. In fact, it may actually better it because that prevents the criminal enterprise that we have running the Department of Justice and the CIA as recently proven. I mean, here we had John Brennan, who has now been outed for lying to Congress. He originally set up this, quote, dossier with the Russians. He made a trip to Moscow that was unofficial because the Russian government did not expect him, and he didn't see his counterparts there. And he was directly involved in getting this delivered and spread about through the media, leaking, which is a crime. But he's a hardcore socialist. Actually, he was a member of the Communist Party since 1973. That's a fact, an admitted one. You got the head of the Department of Justice, multiple top level officials that were involved in this conspiracy that have now been exposed. And you have the FBI, the whole top of that was involved. And, you know, it's just incredible. I had to take this reality and write it as a novel because I don't think people would believe it. And now people are writing it, like Greg Jarrett, amazing journalist and attorney. He just published The Russia Hoax and exposed much of this.
Okay.
Excuse me.
So, all right. So, okay. So it seems then that people will still be sorry, will still be reasonably safe under even if you return to the Constitution.
Oh, they'd be safer because, from my own experience, when they don't start cases at the federal level, they pick a target, then they break the law in every way necessary to force a confession to something one did or did not do, as they did to the Trump's, cooperative people during the campaign that are going to jail for nothing that was stated as the purpose of the investigation. But they hold them in jails and prisons and threaten their family until they say, okay, I'll say I did something, and they do. That's the system of justice in America, and the president just tasted it, which is why I think, as mentioned peripherally, that action is being taken now to free tens of thousands of Americans based on this man's experience. That, my God, they do this every day, and the answer is yes.
Right. Okay. Got that. So, since the novel deals with some current issues, I'd like to touch on something which has recently come out last weekend, the Mueller report. From what I've read so far, or at least Attorney General Barr's summary of it, there was no active collaboration between the president and the Russians, the Russia hoax, so to speak. In your opinion, does this entirely, clear Trump of any connection with the Russians?
Well, first of all, the mandate of Bob Mueller, who actually went to the University of Virginia for law school. He was in law school when I was an undergrad there. He was an arrogant, well, I've got to be careful of my words. You might have children listening, but he was horrible then. He then went on to become the Boston U.S. attorney under under his management of that office, they had Whitey Bulger as an informer and allowed him to murder 16 people while he was in that task, and then alerted him when other officials were going to come and arrest him, and he escaped and was at large for 13 years thanks to Mueller and his gang. So these are not good people or nice people, but his mandate was Russian collusion, and there was none. Trump stated that 231 times that I've counted, yet they continued, and they came up exactly with the same thing. They then tried to alter it midstream and say, well, obstruction of justice for firing the head of the FBI, though the head of the DOJ, Rod Rosenstein, had written a letter recommending it, and every member of Congress on the Democratic side had asked him to do it. But then once he did it, they make it sound like he's obstructing an investigation into his own case, though the head of the FBI told him that he wasn't being investigated. So and you can't obstruct justice when there isn't a crime of reality to be investigated. You know, how do you obstruct justice? By saying, I didn't do it and you people are lying. That's not obstructing justice. That's telling the truth. So this completely vindicates him, but the press is in a meltdown because they have lied. They called him treasonous. The head of the FBI said he was a traitor. Now it turns out the traitor was the head of the FBI. The head of the CIA called him a traitor even last week, said he had proof, and he's now had to backpedal on that. And it turns out that he was the traitor to his country and created this hoax.
Right. Okay. So all things told, I must say that the book is an interesting read. It starts off somewhat slow and information heavy, but things get rolling along as the book progresses. So I must say, this is this is definitely an interesting book, especially if it's very much related to all the facts you've gathered over the years.
Well, everything in it is a fact, and I tried to, as much as I could in the novel, cite my source without getting too academic or boring. But anyone who would like to know exactly what case I'm talking about, I would be happy to share it with them.
Okay, cool. Okay. So, Howell, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words you'd like to say to speak to our listeners? I mean, anything you'd like to tell them?
Well, what concerns me worldwide, not just in my own country, is this pervasive and invasive effort by the so-called progressives, whose mission back in 1871, when John Ruskin, a professor at Oxford, started this whole chain of thought, and one of his students, Sir Cecil Rhodes, ended up writing the notes and considered it so profound, he carried them in his coat pocket for 40 years and then set up this worldwide group of elites. It's history. It's not fantasy or a made-up deal, but a lot of it's been included. But 15 billionaires, not according to me, but according to Ben Bagdikian, a very liberal journalist from the Washington Post, wrote a book called The New Media Monopoly. And in it, he said that 15 of these most powerful people in the world, all billionaires, control 82% of the world's media. That's not an accident either. The first issue of Ben's book I read in 1982, and he was bemoaning the fact that 50 major corporations controlled the media. By the time he wrote the last version 2 years ago when he died, it was down to 5. So this is frightening stuff. So you've got a media under the control of a handful of elites. You've got most governments under control of a handful of elites. You've got Soros invested in every government that he can control. And I just heard a speech Nigel Farage gave at the European Commission the other day where he was being interrupted and heckled. And he said, I'm glad you're doing that because you're on the list of 232 people we've now proven have been bought off by Soros. And I will be discussing that later. So anyway, shut them up pretty quickly. So when you have this small clique basically proving that these elites almost had the world under control, but that's why they hate President Trump so badly. And I felt like he needed some backup because the world is against him because they are controlling the world, the media, the governments, and these deep state operatives that have now been outed in an investigation where they were trying to ruin him. It's all coming true. And people need to wake up that they need to do their own thinking and dig deeper than turning on a channel and hearing the same parrot heads say the same thing. And I'll just end with a key thought that the next time people are channel jumping between news media outlets, Notice that you hear the same term from all these different groups every day. If one of them is talking about conspiracy, then every one of them says the same talking point, and they'll pick a word, and that also is a construct that was created back in the 60s called Mockingbird, if they want to look it up. It was a CIA program that is now in full sway, but I'll leave it at there.
Okay, all right. So definitely something for our listeners to look into themselves and get a feel for how this thing actually works.
It's insidious, but I do believe that this man is going to change it or they'll kill him.
Right, okay.
And I don't want to take odds on which one first.
Yeah, definitely. I got that. Okay, then, so in closing then, the book is The Lawyer's Guild. The authors are guests, Howell Woltz, and you can find this book on Amazon. So Howell, thank you very much for being on Author Story yet again. I must say it's very interesting speaking to you both times.
Well, thank you, Alex, and I wish you the best of luck.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And there it is, folks. Please check out the Lawyers Guild as well as their other authors and books, which we've already covered in Author Story. And, of course, by all means, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. So we'll see you guys all next time on Author Story, where we speak to another great author about another awesome book.